Kia ora te whānau, anau mai haere mai ki te wiki tua ono. My response for week 6 we're still looking at the reading. Research is Ceremony by Shawn Wilson, looking at Indigenous research methods. So we're going to be looking at chapter 3 this week. Looking at what he actually goes further into research over the last since the 1700s until the late 2000s. So I just start off talking about his different writing styles again. Like I talked about previously in the week 5 chapters 1 and 2. There's an interesting writing style. So you've got academic and more of like a relaxed writing style, which I really liked. What do you say here? Page 44. I'm fairly sure that they will forgive me for doing this, as I'm equally sure that they have had to do the same thing themselves in their academic career. So he's talking about he took all of these other literature and put it and talked about them and criticized them, and he like apologizes as if he was talking to them directly to them, which I find really interesting as I read through this book. Just his writing styles, that he sort of pulls away from the academic writing style, and I feel is more of like an indigenous or decolonized writing style, talking straight to the person, something that's sort of less formal, and I feel you wouldn't really find in different readings. Anyways, further on, he talks about the 5 phases of Aboriginal research or indigenous research. Yeah, coming from the 1700s to the early 2000s. Sorry, I said late 2000s before, early 2000s. So it starts off, there's 5 different researchers. So there's the Terra Nullius, phase. I hope I'm saying that right. Traditionalization phase, assimilation phase, early Aboriginal research phase, and a recent Aboriginal research phase. So I'm just going to break down these and sort of just highlight different parts about it. Firstly, starting off with the Terra Nullius phase. I do hope I'm saying that right. 1700s to the 1900s, so about a 200-year gap, or 130 years. It's actually 1770 to 1900s. It's talking about here, page 45, the Terra Nullius phase of research with Aboriginal Australian people and Aboriginal lands began with Captain James Cook declaring Australia as Terra Nullius, empty land. So Captain James Cook decided that he would go to Australia, or travel to Australia, and said this place is empty land. It's mine for the taking. So sort of this phase of Aboriginal research, people are conquering the land, taking over different indigenous places. So they sort of talk. It's sort of broken into 2 parts. So the first part is when they first came, just sort of eradicated everybody. Had to clear all the land first. So they'll clear the land of everything it had on it. You know, trees, people, anything that was on it, so they can rebuild. So the first part, they were just taking. Second part, they had a government in place, and that's where they're signing these treaty commonwealths, declaring these places free for people. But most of the treaties were written in English, and a lot of the people, the indigenous people, Aboriginal people, were citing them, but they didn't quite understand what was happening. So it comes on here, page 47. Designated lands were established as reserves or missions onto which all the indigenous people were forced to relocate, and the government acts and policing of policy, occupants were not allowed to leave the designated areas, nor were they allowed to continue ceremonial practices. So I feel this is talking about they were taking the land and they thought, oh, we'll do research on these people, put them into one place, and sort of telling them they can't do the ceremonial practices. Pretty much the start of genocide, I believe, of indigenous people, of Aboriginal people. Slow start right there from early 1900s and before that. So next phase, the traditionalizing phase, the 1900s to 1940s. So we're talking early 1900s. and it's talking about the scientific measures that people used. This is the research technique that they were using here. Sorry, is that they started taking Aboriginal people, researching on them. Yep. So they were pretty much, it was Linda Smith talks about it in her book, talking about data collecting by dominant researchers, all these data collecting, right, or just stealing data, doing all of these researches on people. So it says here, page 48, collecting in the form of scientific measurements or native intelligence to sort of help our people, right? So doing all these data collections, taking all of these skulls, heads and stuff like that, send them over to libraries over the world, universities and stuff to be studied on. So moving on to the next phase, the assimilation phase. I was reading past here, page 49, says, whilst the savagery research of the previous research phase continued its focus from preserving our cultures to preserving us. So I believe, sorry, this is 1940 to 1970. They're talking about a phase where they were taking us, instead of preserving us, or preserving our cultures, is about preserving us. Instead of being writing about what we do, they started researching and going, oh man, all these people are really poor, you know, they've lost their ways. How can we help them to help themselves? So we need to, this is the you know, the European world going, how can we help these indigenous people? So all of these he talks about it in the previous two chapters, or in actually chapter 2 to be exact. He was talking about all of these professionals, non-Aboriginal professionals, being professionals in Aboriginal context and tikanga and stuff like that. And this is sort of the start of researchers and stuff being professionals in Indigenous stuff without actually being Indigenous themselves. This is the time in the world where they started to talk about it and take their stuff, take their research and try and help our people. So the next one is the early Aboriginal research phase. So it's the 1970s to the 1990s, so just a little over 50 years ago. So this is when we started, where are we? Yeah, this is when we started, this is researching. So a lot of research was still being conducted on us, but our people were sort of helping as well, we were doing our own research on ourselves, but it was still coming from a Western perspective. That's where we transition into the recent Aboriginal research phase, 1990 to 2000. So that was only 20, what years? Yeah, about just 20 years ago. And it's talking about how we found our own feet, and this is the start of actual Indigenous research in my point of view. So page 51, a place was made for collaborative research. More importantly, Indigenous scholars begin to assert their power. No longer would they allow others to speak in their place. They began to articulate their own Indigenous perspectives and demanded to be heard in doing so. So in this phase, the recent Aboriginal research phase, Indigenous researchers moved away from this Western construct and moved towards their own stuff, and they don't need people to talk for them. They're doing their own research on the inside looking in. Yeah, I've talked way too long than I really wanted to. There's a couple of other things I just want to highlight. If we go to page 58, they start talking about the criterion for Indigenous research. So Judy Atkinson's has a really good criteria for Indigenous research, and it's talking about respect and stuff like that, which is a good template for all of us doing Indigenous research to sort of pick apart and sort of take it from her culture and paste it onto ours. And they also talk about ontologies and epistemologies. So top of page 58, they said I would teach the names of the moons, or they talked about how they'll teach the names of the moons and stuff for fishing cycles, and that knowing the phase of the moons will determine what kind of fish there are, and you will understand the type of splash zones, the type of seaweed will be able to tell you the quality of the ocean currents, and knowing the Hawaiian names of the moon tells you the seasons and what month it are. So that's talking about epistemologies coming from a Hawaiian perspective, and how they're actually quite valid in telling, or it's quite important to know them. And if you do know these things, you're going to know a lot. Just taking one of what type of fish is in the awa, you'll be able to figure out what kind of currents or ocean currents are happening at that time. Further on down the page, it says the notion that empirical evidence is sounder than cultural knowledge permeates Western thought but alienates many indigenous scholars. Rather than the cultural knowledge being seen as an extra intellectual, it is denigrated. It is the notion of superiority of empirical knowledge that leads to the idea that written text supersedes oral traditions. So it's talking about empirical evidence versus cultural knowledge, and written text versus oral traditions, and sort of which one is higher in a lot of westernized research perspectives. Empirical evidence and written text is held higher than cultural knowledge and oral traditions, and it all comes down to ontology, looking at what is real and what is real in this world, and especially looking at like cultural knowledge, oral teachings. What is real? Is the moon real? You know, is this Wairua real? Can you tell from the stars that this is going to happen? So I believe from a Western perspective, it's definitely empirical evidence and written text is higher, but coming in from a indigenous perspective, indigenous research perspective, this cultural knowledge of when the leaves fall off the tree, this happens, is 100% true, and is can be used as evidence, I believe. And these old traditions being handed down, just because they're not written down on a piece of paper, doesn't mean that they don't hold any value. So yeah, that was chapter 3. I've gone on way too long over, but hopefully I made sense and talked about what I really talked about. It's a bit of a blur. Just trying to get all these readings done. Yeah, but that was chapter 3, breaking down chapter 3. We're Researcher Ceremony, Shawn Wilson's text, talking about indigenous research methods. So yeah, kia ora.